All right, so today we're diving into this case that really shook Albuquerque, New Mexico, and it had the whole country talking. We're talking about the
Mm.
killings of four Muslim men, and yeah, it's a story that you think it's going one way, and then it takes some pretty wild turns.
It's a real head scratcher, you know? You
Yeah.
start out thinking you're dealing with one thing and then bam, everything changes. Cases like this really just show you how important it is to kind of look at things from all sides, keep an open mind.
Okay, so to get us started with this deep dive, why don't we hear about one of the victims? I mean, this wasn't just like some abstract case, right? These are real people, people with families and lives and everything.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think starting with Muhammad Ahmadi is a good place to start. He was shot and killed outside the business that he ran with his brother back in November 2021. At the time, it was just this awful tragedy, obviously, but nobody was really thinking, serial killer or anything like that.
Yeah, tragic but isolated, right?
Exactly. It didn't really set off any alarm bells. But then, unfortunately, just a few months later, in July 2022, Aftab Hussein was found dead. And he was a Pakistani American, part of the Hazara ethnic group, and he had been shot multiple times.
Okay, so now we're starting to maybe see a little bit of a pattern here. Two Muslim men murdered.
And it gets worse. Just days after Aftab Hussein was killed, another Pakistani American man was killed. This time, it was Muhammad Afzal Hussein. He was actually pretty involved in local politics. He even worked on a campaign for a U.S. representative. I mean, just heartbreaking, This guy was out there trying to make a difference, and then this happens.
Yeah, so at this point, I mean, the fear in the Muslim community must have been incredible. It's like, who's next?
Oh, absolutely. You can imagine the tension, right? Every day you're looking over your shoulder, wondering if you're going to be the next target. And then, on August 5th, Naeem Hussein was found shot to death. He was also Pakistani American, and this is when it really hit home for everyone that they might be dealing with a serial killer, someone targeting Muslims.
Yeah, that's chilling stuff. You read about these cases, but to actually like be living through it must have been terrifying.
Absolutely. It's just a whole different level of fear. And that fear just fueled the pressure on law enforcement. They had to find this guy and fast.
Right. So let's get into that. What were some of the big breaks in the investigation?
Well, the police, they released information about a vehicle of interest, and asked for the public's help. And that turned out to be a huge lead. They also started using cell phone data and ballistics. That's the science of analyzing bullets and firearms to try to link the murders.
Okay, so cell phones, bullets, classic detective work.
Yeah, you got it. And you know what? All that evidence, it eventually led them right to their suspect, Mohammed Atif Syed.
Wait, hold on. Didn't you say that all the victims were Muslim?
That's right.
And Syed is the guy they arrested. What's
Yeah.
going on here? Was this some kind of mistake?
Not a mistake, but definitely a huge twist. Mohammed Atif Syed, the guy they arrested on August 9th, 2022, he was also Muslim.
Wow. I mean, that changes everything, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Imagine you're part of this community and you're terrified that someone is targeting you because of your faith, and then it turns out the suspect is one of your own. Talk about a mind-blowing revelation.
Yeah, it really throws a wrench in the works.
Yeah.
So who is this guy? Where did he come from?
So Syed is an Afghan American. He came to the U.S. as a refugee back in 2016 after fleeing Afghanistan with his family a few years before that. And he claimed he was part of the Afghan National Army and even fought against the Taliban. But, get this, experts have looked into his claims and they're saying they're pretty fishy. There's actually no official record of him serving in the military.
Huh. So we've got a potential serial killer, and he might be embellishing his past a bit?
Or a lot, potentially. And here's something else. To make things even more interesting, there were some red flags in his past even before the murders. He had a history of domestic violence charges against him, allegations of assault against his wife and son.
Okay, now we're getting into some dark territory here.
Huh.
Was he ever convicted of those assaults?
He was arrested 3 times but never actually convicted. The cases were either dropped because the victims wouldn't testify or because Syed completed some kind of pre-trial program.
So there's a pattern violence, but there was nothing concrete enough to really nail him down before all of this.
Right. And now we've got this huge question, this looming question, motive. Why would a Muslim man target other Muslims?
It doesn't really add up, does it?
That's the million-dollar question for sure. Authorities have kind of tossed around a few different theories, maybe personal conflicts, maybe even something to do with different sects within Islam. But honestly, it's still a mystery.
And to make things even more complicated, Syed denied having anything to do with the killings at all. And to add even more fuel to the fire, the brother of one of the victims said he didn't believe it was religiously motivated at all.
Yeah, it's like trying to solve a puzzle, but some of the pieces are missing, and the ones you do have, they don't quite fit together. And there's one more piece to this puzzle that really throws things for a loop. Remember Syed's son?
The one he was accused of assaulting.
That's him. Well, he was also under suspicion in the murders.
Hold on, his son. What made the police think he was involved?
They found some stuff in his room, cell phone data, and a gun, and it seemed to link him to the crimes. They even considered trying to detain him.
So father and son potentially involved. This is getting crazy.
It definitely adds a whole other layer of intrigue. But there's a catch. He was never actually charged with murder.
Wait, so what happened to him? Did he get away with it?
Well, not exactly. He ended up pleading guilty to something else entirely, a firearms charge. He lied about his address when he bought a gun back in 2021.
So lying on a federal form gets him in trouble, but potentially being involved in multiple murders doesn't. I mean, what happened there?
Well, he spent some time in a halfway house, served his sentence for that firearms charge, and that was basically it. But the fact that he was even considered a suspect just adds another layer of mystery to this whole case.
Man, this is making my head spin. So we've got a father and son, both potentially linked to these murders, a motive that's totally unclear, and a whole community just reeling from the fear and the shock of it all. What happened next? What was the final outcome?
Well, that's where things start to get really interesting. But to hear about that, you'll have to wait for the next part of this deep dive.
All right, folks, you heard it here. Hang tight, because we'll be back soon to uncover the rest of this story. Okay, so we left off with a ton of unanswered questions about these killings in Albuquerque. We've got Mohammed Atif Syed, who's the main suspect, and his son's caught up in the whole thing too. And no one can figure out a motive. So where do we even go from here?
Well, let's talk about what happened, legally speaking. In March of 2024, Syed went on trial for the murder of Aftab Hussein, and the jury found him guilty. First-degree murder.
Whoa, first degree. So that's as serious as it gets, right?
Yeah, that's the top charge. And in New Mexico, that means he was automatically facing at least 30 years to life in prison. But, hold on, because that's just for one killing.
Right. There were 4 victims total, so did they try him for all of them?
They actually didn't. In September of 2024, he agreed to a plea deal for the deaths of Mohammed and Naeem Hussein. So instead of going to trial for those 2, he pleaded no contest to 2 counts of second-degree murder.
No contest. That's not, exactly the same as pleading guilty, right?
Yeah, it's kind of this weird legal thing. It's not admitting guilt exactly, but it means he's not going to fight the charges anymore. He's basically accepting the punishment without a whole trial.
So, I guess a smart move for him if he's probably going to lose anyway. What was the sentence for those charges?
For each of those second-degree murder charges, he got 30 years. And the good news for Syed, I guess, is that those sentences run at the same time as the first-degree murder sentence.
Okay, so no matter what, he's spending at least 30 years locked up, maybe even the rest of his life.
Exactly. He was officially sentenced in November 2024, life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years, but, no guarantees.
You'd think that would be the end of it, right? Case closed. But something tells me there's more to it.
You're reading my mind. Even with the conviction and the sentencing, this case is far from over. There are still so many unanswered questions.
What's the motive, right? That's a big one.
For sure. We still don't really know why he did it. Was it personal? Was it something related to different groups within Islam? Something we're just not seeing? We may never know. And that's kind of disturbing, to be honest.
And what about the Muslim community in Albuquerque? They went through so much fear during the killings, and then to find out the suspect was also Muslim, that must have been a lot to process.
It was a huge blow. Imagine going through all that fear, thinking someone's targeting you because of your faith, and then finding out the suspect was one of your own.
It makes you wonder, how something like this affects a whole community, how it shapes people's views of each other.
There's no doubt it left a mark. Some people probably felt betrayed. Others might worry about facing backlash or suspicion, just because they're Muslim, too. It's a lot to deal with.
And thinking about it more broadly, does this say anything about Islamophobia in America in general? Does it feed into negative stereotypes, even though we don't know the motive?
It's a valid question, for sure. This case definitely adds fuel to that fire. When something like this happens, it's easy to jump to conclusions about a whole group of people based on one person's actions, and that's really dangerous.
It's a reminder to be careful about making assumptions, to see each person as an individual, not just part of some larger group.
Absolutely. We can't let fear and prejudice take over. Remember, most Muslims just want to live their lives peacefully. This case doesn't change that.
Right, right. Okay, so we've talked about the community, but what about the victims' families? I can't imagine what they must have gone through.
I know, it's unimaginable. They lost people they loved in the most horrible way possible. And on top of that grief, they had to deal with the media, the investigation, the trial. It's just heartbreaking.
And was justice really served here?
That's tough to say. Syed's behind bars, but does that really bring back the victims or erase the pain? The families are still grieving, the community's trying to understand what happened, and we have more questions than answers.
It seems like this story has so many layers, so much complexity. It's not just about the crime itself, but about everything that comes after, affecting people, communities, even society as a whole.
That's what's so fascinating and disturbing about this case. It makes us think about violence, prejudice, and the fact that humans can be both good and evil.
Yeah, we've covered a lot here. We've talked about the victims, the suspect, the investigation, the trial, everything. Is there anything else we need to cover before we wrap up?
Well, there's one more thing, one more piece of the puzzle that I think sheds light on how complicated this whole thing is and how hard it is to find justice in a world that's rarely black and white. But for that, my friend, you'll have to wait for the next part of our deep dive.
All right, so we're back. And I gotta say, this whole case has me feeling kind of lost, Like I'm walking through a maze in the dark. We've talked about the killings, the trial, what it all meant for the community. But it feels like every time we think we're getting somewhere, we hit a dead end.
Yeah, I get that. It's like sometimes there just aren't easy answers, especially when you're dealing with people and why they do things.
Right, and this isn't some TV show where everything wraps up perfectly in an hour, This is real life.
Exactly. And that brings us to this part of the story, a part that I think you'll find pretty interesting. It adds like a whole other layer of complexity to this idea of justice,
Huh.
what it really means in a case like this. Remember we talked about Shaheen Syed, the suspect's son?
Yeah, the guy who was under suspicion but never got charged with murder and then ended up pleading guilty to something totally different like a gun charge.
Yep, that's him. Well, get this. After his dad was convicted, Shaheen started talking. He did an interview where he claimed his father confessed to him.
Whoa, wait, hold on. He's saying his own dad admitted to killing those men.
That's what he said. According to Shaheen, his dad told him he did it because he thought the victims had, disrespected his daughter.
So he killed 4 people because of something someone supposedly said about his daughter.
That's what Shaheen is saying. But of course, I gotta be careful with this, right? He's got his own reasons for saying this stuff, and who knows if his dad really confessed or if he's making it up to make himself look better or get back at his dad. Who knows?
It's like he's throwing in another puzzle piece, but it doesn't quite fit, Just makes things more confusing.
Yeah, for sure. It makes you wonder, is he telling the truth? Is he covering for himself? Trying to get revenge on his dad? We might never know the real story.
It shows that even when a case seems closed, there's always those loose ends, those doubts that stick around.
Yeah, and I think that's part of what makes this whole thing so, thought-provoking. It reminds us that even with a conviction, we might never know everything. We may never really understand why this horrible thing happened.
That's a hard thing to accept. We naturally want closure
Yeah.
to understand why these things happen.
I know, but sometimes the best we can do is just recognize that it's complicated, that there are things we don't know and maybe never will.
So where does all of this leave us? What do we take away from this whole thing?
I think this case gives us a lot to think about. It challenges our ideas about why people do things. It shows how complex relationships between different faiths can be. And it reminds us that prejudice and violence are still very real, even in a place like America.
Yeah. It's a reminder that we can't just sit back and think everything's okay. We have to actively fight against hatred and bigotry wherever we see it.
Absolutely. And on a more personal level, I think this case shows how important it is to try and understand each other, to have empathy. We got to listen to each other's stories, see things from different points of view.
It's about building bridges, not walls. Right. Seeing our shared humanity, even when we disagree.
You said it. This whole conversation has really got me thinking about how powerful stories can be. We started with the stories of the victims, and now we're ending with the son's story. each one adds another piece, another layer to the whole thing.
It's like those Russian dolls, you know? You open one and there's another one inside.
Exactly. And it shows that there's always more to discover, more to learn, more to understand. That's the beauty and the challenge of life, right?
Well, folks, I think that wraps up our deep dive for today. We've explored a lot of tough stuff here, tried to make sense of it all, and hopefully you've come away with a better understanding of just how complicated this case really is.
It's been quite a journey. And to everyone listening, I encourage you to keep thinking about this case, to keep asking questions, to keep trying to understand.
Because these are the kinds of conversations that make us grow, you know, that help us learn and become more informed and engaged people.
I agree.
Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious.